Hello there. I'm Robert McKay. The channel is Whiskey for Beginners, obviously. And I want to talk today about what I call the Balcones touch. Whiskey from Balcones Distilling in Waco, Texas, whether good or bad, and I've had some that I think is just awful, is very distinctive. People talk about Texas whiskey. Well, I've had not all Texas whiskey. I've had TX bourbon. I've had Still Austin bourbon. I've had Longhand corn whiskey, Longhorn corn whiskey. And I've had several things from Balcones. Oh, and I've had the Garrison Brothers boot flask, which I thought was horrible. But the only whiskey that is really distinctive, that does not seem in some way to be trying to emulate Kentucky whiskey and whiskey from Tennessee and other places in the South, is that which comes from Balcones. And people love to hate Balcones whiskey, and I think that's why they expect their whiskey to taste like it come from Louisville or Cascade Hollow there at Tullahoma, Tennessee. That they're looking for Kentucky, Tennessee style whiskey, and Balcones does not fit in that category. I have here a bottle of Lineage, which is they call it Texas single malt whiskey. And by the way, just as a side note, there is no rule that says that you have to put an E in whiskey. There is no rule that says that in countries that have an E in the name, there is an E in whiskey. And the E in whiskey only came about when Irish distillers wanted to differentiate their product from Scottish whiskey because the two are very similar. So you can spell whiskey with an E or without. Nobody's going to jump on you, at least nobody who knows anything. And Balcones does not put an E in whiskey. What they do put in their whiskey is something magical. I love it. But what creates that Balcones touch, that density and complexity and brightness and darkness and all this that makes their whiskey so unique? Well, the climate has something to do with it. Texas is a very large place. You look at Texas on a map and you'll see that it is huge. You could take any number of other states and drop them into Texas multiple times. And so to talk about the Texas climate is somewhat inaccurate. Over in the Trans-Pecos, you have desert. Over along the Sabine River, you have almost a tropical climate. It's almost jungle. And as you go west in Texas, it becomes drier and drier. And now I've never been to Waco, so I take that back. I have been to Waco once, a long time ago, back in the 90s. And I was on the campus of Baylor University, which is as close as I've ever come to a college education. I've been on the Baylor campus, I've been on the Harvard campus, and I have drove past MIT up there in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so I'm a college boy, maybe. No, I'm not. I have no diploma or no degree. But the Waco climate, I can't talk about in any sort of detail. But in general, Texas is hot in the summer. It might not be too much hotter than Kentucky and Tennessee, but it's hotter for longer. And in winter, Texas might not get as cold as Kentucky and Tennessee. And people, you need to understand, in the South, it snows. You get up in the Appalachians and you get snow every year. In Texas and Oklahoma, every year, I have seen snow. I have shoveled snow. And of course, there are the ice storms, which a lot of places don't get. And so it might not get as cold as Kentucky and Tennessee, but it does get cold. And if it warms up suddenly, that's another added aspect of the whiskey interacting with the barrel. And so you get climatic differences which affect the way the whiskey works with the wood, getting the flavors out of the wood, filtering out some of the things that are in the white dog. Then there's how Balcones does its barrels. I first came on this when I was drinking Woodford Reserve Double Oaked. And I took my first sip and I thought, that tastes like Balcones Texas pot still bourbon. And people laughed at me when I said it, but it does. Not identical. Nobody said identical, but there is a lot in common between the two. And what they do with the Woodford, the double oaked, is they put it in a second barrel. That second barrel they toast heavily and then char lightly before they put the whiskey in it. And please excuse me. For once, I'm not sniffing and snuffling because of allergies. My eye went kerflooey. And I started thinking, is that what Balcones does? I looked into it. It turns out that all their barrels, Balcones first toasts and then chars. Now, toasting exposes the wood to heat, but not to actual flame. Or at least if they use flame, it doesn't actually touch the wood. And it's a longer process, and it makes chemical changes in the wood. Charring is where the flame actually scorches the inside of the barrel, in essence turns it to charcoal. And it also makes chemical changes in the wood, but different changes than toasting does. So when you toast first and then char, you get both those kinds of changes, and they're both going into the whiskey. And so that's an essential element in the Balcones touch. Then there are the stills, and the still can make a difference. The Scottish learned that a long time ago, and I would presume the Irish as well. They have very similar climates, very similar whiskey making styles. And there's no way I'd be able to tell the difference in taste between Irish and Scottish whiskey. But the Scottish learned a long time ago that the shape of the still has an effect on the final product. It determines how the whiskey condenses as it goes into the final form, the white dog, or as some people call it, the new make. And I'm an American. In fact, I want to do a video on this. I'm an American. Why not use American terminology? People, for some reason, want to go British in some areas. But the shape of the still matters. And in their very first building, which they'll tell you it's under a bridge. No, the bridge is here. The building is here. It's almost under the bridge, but it's not literally so. But it was an old welding shop. It was fairly small, and the way it was built, the line arm as it came off the still had to stretch a long way because there was a wall in between to get to the condenser. And when they moved into their new building, which they've been in for several years now, a much, much, much bigger building, which tells you how successful Balcones was, no matter who hates the stuff. They got Forsyth in Scotland to design and build their stills, and I don't know why they didn't go to Vendome in Kentucky. That Vendome makes stills for all sorts of distilleries. They're the American still builders, the epitome of it. But they went to Forsyth, and Forsyth, having a different setup to work with, didn't make a long line arm this way. Instead, it comes off the top of the still and goes back down and then spirals around to get that length. And then it goes off into the condenser. And in that long line arm, whether it's this way or the spiral, the whiskey is interacting with the copper for a longer time, and that affects the flavor of the white dog, which then affects the flavor of the finished whiskey. And then who knows what processes they have. Yeast makes a difference. The grain you use makes a difference. And Balcones makes it a point to use Texas grain. Their corn is blue corn, at least in some things. In their pot still bourbon, it's roasted Texas blue corn. In their corn whiskey, roasted Texas blue corn. So they're also roasting the corn before they grind it up and mash in. They're using pot stills rather than column stills. And as a general rule, more flavor comes from a pot still than a column still, even if you're using the juice from a column still that comes off down here instead of up here at the higher proof and lower flavor level. Their yeast strain is probably unique. In fact, if I remember correctly, and don't quote me on this, but I believe that their fermenters are up on the roof, open to the air, so that native yeast, and there's yeast in the air everywhere you go. You're breathing yeast. Deal with it. You know, some people would go, if they knew what was in the air. But the native yeast gets in there and has an effect. How the yeast works, what yeast it is, can affect the flavor. And so all these things, some of which I don't know, some of which maybe I don't even think of, go into the juice that we drink from this bottle. People have been making barley whiskey for centuries, 800 years or so. But only Balcones came up with this. Only Balcones has barley whiskey that after 3 years is that dark. Only Balcones has barley whiskey which has so much flavor. You drink Scottish whiskey and Irish whiskey, it's lighter in flavor and color than bourbon whiskey. And this is as dark as bourbon. It has the density of flavor of bourbon. And all this goes into the Balcones touch. And I think they make some of the finest whiskey anybody has ever made anywhere. And if you don't like it, fine. You know, nobody, or not everybody likes the same thing. We all have a different palate. But at least recognize that just because you don't like it doesn't make it trash. You know, so there is some whiskey that, yeah, it's junk, period. But your palate is not the final judge of quality. My palate is not the final judge of quality. And so if you don't like Balcones, say so. Be honest. Don't lie to me or anybody else. But have the decency, have the courtesy to just say, I don't like it, and don't hurl invective at Balcones and those who do. Because it is very different. It's not Kentucky whiskey. It's not Tennessee whiskey. It's not your granddaddy's whiskey. And that difference is probably all that is putting you off. The fact that it's not what you're used to. But anyway, that's the Balcones touch and a few words of exhortation to certain people, not all by any means, just a few. And at this point then, I raise my imaginary glass full of imaginary whiskey and say, here's how.